I'm delighted you're here.
Yeah. Danny, do you have a bird side? Okay.
So I'm Roxanne Cody, for those of you that I might not know. And I want to commend you on the intelligence of showing up tonight, because there will be people contacting you saying, oh, were you there the night? So, but we were all saying, how come we're not in Clinton Town Hall? Yeah. Why? Yeah. I have the same question. So, there's a couple of things I'd like to say in introducing our authors. Dani Shapiro, I think all of you know, Dani's been a favorite author of the store. She's written 11 books. And her latest book, Signal Fires, I have described as pitch perfect fiction. Like, there's not a person on the planet that I've given Signal Fires to that hasn't been thrilled that they got to read that book. So that's, and you ought to read Inheritance. You ought to read all of them. Oh, we decided they didn't need to read one, right? Read the other. Rumaan has never been to the store. This is his fourth book. His last book was shortlisted for the National Book Award, was made into a critically acclaimed film with that little Julia Roberts. His latest book, Entitlement, I was mentioning this to Rumaan at dinner. When I think about what makes fiction great, the term I often use is it rearranges your brain. And Entitlement is one of the most seductive novels I have ever read. The ending, it's not, I didn't think of it as a psychological thriller, but that's what it became and made me want to go back and read it, and has rearranged my brain. And a lot of books today don't feel like they're rearranging their brain. They feel like they're, M&Ms or popcorn, and sometimes M&Ms and popcorn is great, but sometimes you want a real meal that feels satisfying and changes how you think about the world. And that's exactly what Rumaan has done with Entitlement. So I am incredibly grateful that these two esteemed writers are here, and sorry that there's so few of us, but here's going to be your job. Let me just explain this. Whenever we've had events with just a disappointing number of people to my taste, and it's been for writers ranging from Anita Shreve to Jennifer Egan, because people weren't paying attention. You have a job. Your job is to spread the word. You need to be exponential about your enthusiasm. So before I let you listen to these authors, you have to make that commitment. I'm not going to make you raise your hand. That is about what you're going to have to do. So with that, please join me in enthusiastic welcome for Dani.
Hi, everyone. Roxanne is, she's turned everyone into evangelists. It's such a treat to be here with Rumaan, and it's such a treat to be back at RJ Julia, which is one of my very favorite bookstores in the country. Rumaan, we didn't even talk about this, but I was hoping that you might read a teeny little.
Yeah.
We didn't talk about it.
We didn't talk about it.
Sorry.
We were
talking-
Roxanne was
We
distracting
were
us by-
distracting.
We were talking
Yeah,
about
other-
everything else.
Yeah.
But
I think it's always so
Yeah.
helpful to hear
sure.
a little bit in the author's voice and
Mhm.
Yeah.
I like to read. I've only read from this book once, but I can.
This is day two.
This
book
is day two. This book
is
just
a
came out.
newborn.
Yeah.
Its birth was yesterday.
It was. So therefore, I can't even remember what to be reading. But Okay, do you want me to do the synopsis, Danny, or do you want to do the synopsis of what the novel is?
I have my own thoughts about how to do that.
Okay.
Or but talk a little bit about.
All right.
I'd love to know what.
I'll give you the context of what I will read. This is a book about a woman who is 33, which I think is young. I think culturally we've agreed that 33 is young, who goes to work for a man who is 83 at the end of his life, and he is an American billionaire and is giving away his fortune before he dies. And she's gone to work for him at his private family foundation, which is the very feeble, rickety machine that he has erected to give away his fortune. I'm going to read a section from the very beginning. Novelistically, I'm part of this because it's almost like a Wikipedia entry, and it's very useful to like just explain who this man is. And it's so this is Brooke, the protagonist, speaking, explaining to her mother. Not really, because it's not dialogue. Anyway, she's thinking about who her boss is. So it's not very long because when you read, I say this all the time, when you want your children to go to sleep, you read to them. So I don't want you guys to notice it. It's literally the truth. When you want your kids to go to sleep, read to them. So I don't want to put you all to sleep. He founded Jaffe Office Supply. Brooke knew the whole story. Asher Jaffe had taken over his maternal uncle's stationery shop. Asher registered at Brooklyn College to avoid being sent to Seoul, left before getting a degree, and opened an outpost in the financial district, catering to office supply managers instead of flatbush school kids in search of rubbers and pencils. In time, there were trucks. Jaffe in a jiffy. Advertising Age called this slogan one of the greatest of the 20th century. Its 6 syllables contain its entire promise. It was written by Asher Jaffe himself. Asher bought out his uncle. He married a girl named Barbara and expanded into a catalog business. Asher was seer. He saw the inevitability of the computer, and Jaffe could be relied on for magnetic tape. Asher was overachiever. He realized he was providing paper for others to print on, so expanded into that business. Asher was lucky. That subsidiary business of printing pages of mazes and word searches to be laid on the plastic trays at thousands of McDonald's nationwide made him a millionaire. Asher and Barbara became parents the day Kennedy was shot. Linda Jaffe died at her desk at Cantor Fitzgerald 38 years later, a whole life in the parentheses between American tragedies. By September 11th, 2001, Asher was already a billionaire. Real estate, mostly. In the 1980s, he'd balked at expanding retail operations because his grandfather had taught him that it was wasteful to pay rent. By the magic of math, the malls he'd acquired in the name of thrift became more profitable than the ledgers and staplers still ferried about Chicago and San Francisco in yellow trucks emblazoned with the old-fashioned promise of a jiffy. His and Barbara's divorce occasioned a battle royale for custody of a Monet in the 81st Street townhouse. She got the painting, he got the mansion. He met Carol in one of those corporate photo ops men like him often had to endure. She was there to attest that Jaffe was an equal opportunity employer. That their first meeting was for the camera's benefit foreshadowed the tabloid's interest in the blonde from St. Paul, a gold digger who hit the motherlode, as they told it. Jaffe sold Jaffe before the recession destroyed the company. He was an informal economic advisor to the elder Bush's administration, invested, wisely, Microsoft, joined corporate boards, wrote a business book, paper thin, making $1 million out of nothing, monitored his money, and then resolved to give it all away. The man's own words about the death of his daughter were an early viral sensation for his friend Ariana's new publishing venture. Some actuary had sat down and done the math. Uncle Sam tendered $3 million of condolence. In the face of reality, Jaffe wrote, money means nothing. The question is how to make a life with meaning. So he was declaring it aloud. He would get rid of his money until he was left with only peace. That right there was the mission statement Jody so badly wanted. There was disagreement on the internet as to Asher's net worth, but Brooke trusted Forbes, which put it around $3.7 billion.
Thank you.
Sure.
No, it's so interesting listening to that because do you think of Entitlement as Brooke's story? Or
Well, I hope the reader will have an experience of like getting acquainted with the man that I
Yes.
just described
yeah,
and realize that he kind of sucks the air up in the book and it is a challenge to keep him from stealing
Mm.
the center or the spotlight in the novel's action.
because to me, that's part of the beautiful tension
Thank you.
in the novel
Yeah,
is
thank
that
you.
so we have this 33-year-old woman character, Brooke, who psychologically the tension in the novel is her trajectory from idealism and kind of believing
Mhm,
to a kind of tenuous, complicated relationship with that idealism
mhm,
and belief and how much of that is really true
mhm,
for herself. And ultimately, a kind of want that takes her over in some way, because of this proximity, more than proximity, it's like she feels she's practically been adopted
mhm.
by Asher. And so there is there's such a richness to that journey of hers with this outsized figure who does threaten to suck all the energy from the room.
In the novel.
But he doesn't.
Well, I think it's my hope is that I think it would be it would be comparatively easy for one particular exercise to have made him an evil billionaire. If he were a defense contractor, if he were a pharmaceutical heir, right? We hate those guys. Like that's easy.
Easy.
Right? That's easy. We hate those guys. It's more complicated, I think, and I hope that he has made his fortune in this preposterous way, which I would also point out is possible. And in fact, the editor of the New York Times, his father is an office supply billionaire. So I was very satisfied to learn that. 'Cause I was like, oh, it is possible to actually make $1 billion selling pretzels. Now we know. I think the reader needs to feel as seduced like him, this man that I just read about, as the protagonist of the novel does, right?
Yeah.
Like you have to feel like, oh, this guy, like whatever your sort of personal politics are, especially when it comes to sort of money, you have to read it and feel like, yeah, he's cool. I like him. He buys art. He's giving his money away at the end of his
And
life.
he's doing it in partly, I mean, the impetus is grief. And so that makes him a sympathetic character as well.
Yeah.
Not that he necessarily, we talked about sympathetic characters at dinner a little bit.
We did.
It's I don't know, what we were talking about was that readers have been in many ways trained to feel like we have to like all of the characters that we're reading about. And I think you and I both rebel against that idea.
Well,
But there's-
you know who writes books where everyone is likable?
Mm.
Richard Scarry.
Yeah.
He's the only one. No one in
He's
this
the
room
best.
is an amazing writer, a gifted artist. But that is not what anyone in this room wants to read. If you are in search of a fiction that captures the complexity of actual life, what's the story if there's no friction?
Right.
Oh, everybody was happy and went home happy?
Yeah.
What kind of story is that?
Right.
That's not a story at all,
Right.
you know? And that is not a fiction that, to me, approaches what fiction ought to do, which is make you think about reality. And that's not to say that fiction can't then provide an escape from your own grim reality. I mean, I don't want to think about the presidential election, so I read novels, but I don't want to read Richard Scarry. I want to read novels where complicated people are doing the stupid things that people do every day, and where Donald Trump is not involved. You know, like that's what I want out of fiction, and I think so. I think yeah, this is what we. I mean, I'm yelling at you, telling you something we've already talked about, but you know, this is the thing that drives me wild about. You know.
Well, and it's something that I think, like, you succeed so beautifully at, in this novel, where you have these flawed, complicated, nuanced characters, all of them, who are acting out of their own, I mean, Carl Jung once said, until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives and we will call it fate. Yeah, so you have these characters who are all, as we all are as human beings, driven by their unconscious that has not been made wholly conscious, because that's the human condition. And the interplay between them, between all of them, is what I think propels the psychological drama of the novel, because nobody's, you know, what Brooke might say she's doing is not entirely what Brooke is doing. You know, what Asher might say he's doing is not entirely what Asher is doing.
And that feels very real to me.
Right, exactly.
That feels like how life functions, sometimes against our own, well, you know, like your own motivations are legible to you. I don't know. I mean, I think it sort of just depends on what the aspiration of an individual novel is, I suppose. But like that's sort of what I love in a book, is when it sort of, that's what makes it feel most real to me. You know.
Danny, what's interesting about you saying that quote, which I've not heard, that makes me rethink how we get to know Brooke. Because what I think, when I was talking about the book being seductive, it's seductive in that you take Brooke at very different levels of knowledge at different points. But some of what makes the book intriguing is Brooke's own unconscious in driving her own behavior. And whether we're as unconscious as she is along the way or not, is what creates a lot of the tension in the book. I think. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, because you're watching a young-ish woman. You can see the cliff toward which she is barreling.
Exactly. The experience of being the
Yeah.
reader is a little bit like, oh no, no,
Yes.
no, no,
Yes.
no, don't do that. Oh,
But the same has been true, I think, for most of us in our lives, especially
Right.
when you're youth, right? When you're 22 and you're like, oh, I think this guy really likes me. And your friends are like, oh, babe, oh, you're barreling toward the cliff, but you have to get to the cliff on your own. The reader can't protect, you know, it's not like clapping to Will Tinkerbell back to life. Like you can't stop.
I may be stupid, but I didn't see the cliff.
Well, that's,
Or maybe I was hoping there was
well,
no
I think
cliff.
maybe you're hoping there's no.
you're hoping that
You know.
she, you know, that it won't, that
There'll be a way out.
yeah, that she's kind of finding her way into something that she'll be able to extract herself from with some kind of grace or ease. And that
Doesn't
to
sound
me,
like she does.
well, one thing I want to say is we're not going to talk about the ending of this novel, because you're all going to read it. It's
Of course they're gonna read it. I just told them.
yeah, I know. I'm not going to be able to look. I never let someone else read it. But there's the you don't see it coming kind of ending that also ends up being like, oh, of course, it's exactly. As opposed to the you don't see it coming ending like what,
Mhm.
you know,
Mhm.
but the really earned, I didn't see that coming kind of ending. So we're not going to talk about the ending, but one of the things I really do want to talk about is the way that you have written, both in Leave the World Behind and in Entitlement, about our relationship with money. And it's become something, and I don't know whether it continues to, to haunt you, obsess you. I always say about writers that, theme is just a fancy word for what obsesses us. And,
Yeah.
and then that kind of becomes our,
Yeah.
but in both of these novels, you explore that, you play with that a lot. And with Asher, it's funny that you said that about the way that he makes his fortune, because I've often thought some of the wealthiest people that I either know or know about made their fortune on like the tops of salt shakers or and I loved that you made Asher someone who wasn't, kind of building the evil empire.
Or like there's also a lot of money. A lot of money accrues in like weird abstraction, where the money is made on the trading of money. And so then you're just like, well, what are you even really talking about? That's sort of beyond my ability to comprehend. Money is of interest to me because, and I think this is what the book is litigating, is that once you pay attention to it, and this is true for anything, they will set one, it is said often, once you pay attention to it, you begin to feel a little crazy in realizing its omnipresence. There's like a famous test of this of like, did you see the red car? Like if I say that to you when we're driving, then you'll begin to see the red car. And so money is like the red car. I'm going to tell you a story that I could not fit into the timeline of this book, because this book is set in 2014. But in 2019, when Notre Dame burned down, this is a long story, but it's okay. When Notre Dame burned down, there's a French luxury goods billionaire named Francois Pinault, who owns the Gucci Group, who said, was outraged, of course, as most of us were, and said, I'm going to give 250 million euro to restore Notre Dame. That is my promise to the French nation. And he has a rival named Bernard Arnault, who is considered by people who do this math the richest person alive, who owns LVMH. And he said, well, I also will give 250 million euro, obviously. And both of these men were celebrated for this. And should they be celebrated for that? Sure, of course, right? I did the math. I'm not good at doing math, but I did do the math. Bernard Arnault giving 250 million euro as a percentage of his net worth is the equivalent of me giving $10,000. I'm a novelist, so my net worth is very modest. But if my sister said to me, I need $10,000, I could do it. And even if I were really moved to give $10,000 to Notre Dame, I could do it. So is that really generous? Or is it not? And is it not, as an additional matter, debased? What is Notre Dame? It is the house of God. And the French state, of all nations on the planet, the French state could not simply say, oh, you are worth 200 billion euro? We're taking 1 billion of that. Sorry, but that belongs to us now. Because Notre Dame, A, belongs to God, but also B, belongs to human civilization. It is an accomplishment of human civilization. We live in a very debased moment in which a transaction like the one I just described is possible. Tonight at dinner, Elon Musk's name came up. My children know who Elon Musk is and care about it. It is appalling. Did people talk about Andrew Carnegie over dinner 100 years ago? I hope not. I really hope not, because that seems so fucking boring. But here we are. Something is wrong with what we have made of society.
Deeply so.
Right?
Well, and what you did with Asher is there's this foundation that is trying to give away all this money, and they can't give it away fast enough. They can't he can't give it away.
It's almost comic,
It's,
yeah.
yeah, I mean, he's making, the money is making so much money that I don't know that I would call it burdensome,
Yeah.
but it's not accomplishing the thing that he wanted it to accomplish. And then, you know, we have Brooke, who, you know, grew up in Manhattan, in upper middle class circumstances.
Which makes you
middle-
rich in any.
In
part of the
any,
country,
in any other,
yes,
well, that's, I mean, I just feel like this novel plays with wealth and class in ways that are, as its preoccupation, you know, it makes me think of, you know, Balzac and, what you call it,
James Morton, I'm
Yeah,
saying a lot about
yeah.
these guys.
Lost Illusions was the book I was.
Oh, okay,
But,
yeah.
but the way in which for Brooke, the entering into this world, which is not, it's not entirely unfamiliar to
Mhm.
her. And yet the seduction of it, what she hopes to do.
Mhm.
And then ultimately the slow, like frog in boiling water
Mhm.
kind of thing that happens to her, which is, you know, I could have a little of that. Which is where, that's the cliff, right?
Yeah,
That's, we see that happening and I mean, I understood it completely. As it was happening, but it was like a kind of, like I'd love for you to talk a little bit about Brooke's two friends, Matthew and Kim, because there's also inherited wealth,
Mhm.
that Kim has, and she comes into that
Mhm.
inheritance, and it changes the dynamic between them, or they don't want it to.
But I mean, money is, this is what money does. It touches things. There are like, I made a list, and there are only 3 things on the list where money does not figure, and there are like caveats for all 3 of them. Money, in my opinion, does not figure in romantic love. But like, if you love someone and want to take them out to dinner, it costs money. Money does not figure in family life. But if your mother is 90 and you need to put her into a facility, that takes money. Or if you are unable to simply have a child and it requires like IVF or something, that requires a lot of money. And money does not figure in individual faith, although the Catholic Church owns like Christ and
Everything.
So, right, like how I don't know how to square that. But money is present in everything else. And it's simply true. And we have to accept it. But there's a perception or an understanding that it isn't polite to talk about it. So it can affect the sort of like development or the trajectory of intimacy. So Brooke has these 2 friends from her relative youth, from their college days. Those are foundational, deep relationships that you make. But when you are, as I am, a product of like a certain kind of college, it's almost like it's like you're lifted outside of your family context and placed in this place where where the intellectual life is what matters. And so it may be illegible to you that your roommate is, I have a friend who went to Princeton. She is a brilliant woman. She is a kid from the Bronx whose parents came here from, Ghana. So she is the child of Ghanaian immigrants who grew up in the Bronx. And she went to Princeton as an undergraduate, and her roommate, this woman is Black, her roommate is also Black. But her roommate is from London and is the daughter of like African expats who live in London who are billionaires. And so, in a way, the housing administration at Princeton was like, oh, these 2 young women will be perfect roommates to one another. They can sort of navigate this, this territory together, and that will be great. True in one way, but also profoundly untrue in another way, because money is a big factor here. And it's hard to account for that. And it's impolite to talk about it. And it's not to say that like a rich person would have nothing to say to a person who is less rich. And also it's very important in this book that I'm talking about the rich and the less rich, not the rich and the poor. Like Brooke is not she is not the child of a working class person. She is someone who's very comfortable in the milieu of her billionaire boss. She understands its codes and its, language, but she is undone, as I think most people would be, by the sheer power of the kind of money that is possible to accrue right now in this culture, and by a realization that money is so present that, there's a really great Roald Dahl story, like it's a story for adults. He wrote like wild short fiction, but he wrote a short story, I can't remember the name of it, but it's about a man who invents a machine that allows him to hear the plants. So you can hear what plants are saying, what plants are communicating. But it drives him insane because the plants are all screaming. It's like an omnipresent like terror that the plants have of what humans have done to them. And I think this book is like trading on a similar feeling of like, if you really have to pay attention to what is happening, even with this most benign, genial, art collecting, well-intentioned billionaire, I think this is sort of like an inevitable conclusion.
So, Danny, do you mind if I ask?
Shop it, it's your store.
Yeah. So two things come to mind as I'm listening to this conversation. And I'd be interested in both your thoughts. One is, there was a book that came out a few years ago. I'm like our customers, I don't remember the title, and I can see the jacket, and his first name began with an A and his second name began with a G. But it was about this notion that in the United States, which is different than other parts of the world, rather than have high taxes and let the government decide.
I know exactly what book you're talking about. Anand Giridhara's book.
Right, exactly, thank you.
I should be a bookseller.
Hey, Jim, you've got a job. If this writing gig doesn't work out, your family can move to Madison. And so that theory is, well, why should people who have not been taxed adequately get to decide how money's being spent? Because then, as is depicted by Asher, it becomes somewhat whimsical, meaning subject to a whim, not meaningless, but subject to a whim. And there's different ways to think about that, right? Let rich people decide who's going to get taken care of, or tax them, and let the government decide in its efficient or inefficient way how the money is going to get spent. That's question one. Question two is, there's a lot of debate, particularly with the candidates that we have running, that the notion of class has superseded the notion of race as the source of divisiveness, that it's less race than it might have been 30 years ago, and it's more a divisiveness. And your Princeton roommates reminded me of that. Oh, we got two Black girls, this will work out. Well, they might have nothing in common except the color of their skin, and that's it. So I'd like you both to respond to how you think that impacts what's going on with Asher and Brooke, and how, Rumaan, you're thinking of your characters actually acting out both of those notions.
I think
Have at it.
I think philanthropy is an extraordinary thing. I think there are a lot of great examples of it. Rich people are keeping symphonies and ballets alive across the world, and that's great. But that is a sort of cultural choice that we have made. And philanthropy is really in the eye of the beholder. Betsy DeVos, who astonishingly was the Secretary of Education, and also astonishingly has billions of dollars from running a criminal enterprise, effectively a pyramid scheme, has devoted her fortune to undermining one of the greatest American accomplishments.
And getting a tax deduction.
Right. She has decided to dismantle public education so that the children of the people who clean her house cannot go to good schools. But is that philanthropy? In my estimation, no way. But there are people, according to the letter of American law and American tax law, importantly, it is philanthropy. But the counter argument to that is that Bill Gates, who also unjustly earned a fortune in violation of antitrust law, said, you know what, we should cure malaria.
Yeah.
And he did. And it is extraordinary. And when he dies, that will be the thing that people say about him, and that is an incredible thing. But it's akin to this Notre Dame example. Could the state simply say, like, oh, we really need to cure malaria, so, like, sorry, Bill Gates, like, we're taking some of your money? I think so. Could the state say, like, Betsy DeVos, sorry, you're not allowed to, like, decide how other people with no means educate their children? Yeah, I think so.
So do you
Yeah.
think of Asher as a good philanthropist?
That's up to the people who lead. He does what I would do if I had money.
Mhm.
If I had money on the level that he possesses, he buys a Monet. I wouldn't buy a Monet, but I would buy a Gerhard Richter and I'd be psyched about it. I'd be really psyched about that. You know, I would buy a Helen Frankenthaler and
Yeah.
I'd be psyched about it, you know?
That's where I'd go.
Right?
Helen.
And also he is psyched about it, like he doesn't, there's nothing there, his character, he doesn't strike me as jaded or he is able to continue to take pleasure in what he can do, even though I mean he's able to do that, like he's still there's it's what this is just striking me now, but one of the things that's interesting is that Brooke is the one who wants. Asher is no longer in this state of, I mean, he wants to buy things like, you know, like art or whatever, but he's not, his time of acquiring or grabbing or wanting or grasping is the Buddhist term, right? But he doesn't seem to really have that in his current playbook, and Brooke is the one who kind of actually ends up developing that a little bit.
I mean, it
over
could
the
be
course of
a factor of him being closer to the end of his life.
Yeah.
That's definitely possible, but it also could be a factor, like, it could be you have to have friction and difficulty in your life. Because if you don't, there's no real purpose to it. And he says at one point, like like everybody babies him, and he misses
Yeah.
part of the appeal of the central relationship is that Brooke, even though she is his employee, doesn't sort of kowtow to him. There's, you know, this is like so high-low of me, but there's a scene in the Queen. You remember the movie The Queen, where Helen Mirren's by Queen Elizabeth? There's a scene in which she takes a telephone call in the kitchen and everybody leaves. The servants all vanish. Like if she's walking through the kitchen coming up the hunt, and there's a phone call and everybody has to leave. Because she's the queen and she has to be on the telephone. But there's a way in which like that is very isolating. I wouldn't want to be the queen. It seems horrible, you know? And I don't know that I would want to have, I mean, I would want to have $3.7 billion, but like, would I? I don't know. It seems like it would ruin something about the character of your life, that you would no longer really have a real life or access to a real life.
Or trust in the capacity in the belief that people are telling you.
Being honest
The
with you,
truth.
we're not.
Whether you
we're
want the
simply
truth
seeking
or not.
money, you know?
Rumaan, you know, one of the things I thought a lot about when I was reading the book, both on the part of Asher and Brooke, was this distinction between want and need.
Mhm,
Because Asher, despite all his money, had needs.
mhm.
And I think that's where, you know, my father used to say, I'd rather be rich, happy, and healthy than poor, unhappy, and unhealthy, right? So there is this idea that if you're rich, that solves everything. But we all know wealthy people who still have needs that are not being met. Money can't fix them. Now, obviously, money takes. Did you think about that notion of the difference between want and need when
Yeah.
you were thinking about the characters?
Yeah, I mean, it was very important to me that, again, that Brooke's relationship to her rich boss is not informed by a sense of her own privation. Because that is not compelling, and also that is more, there's more moral clarity there. If you cannot survive, if you have a sick child, and what you need is money to care for them, you can be forgiven. That's a legible motivation. You can be forgiven what you do in response to that. If you simply want to have a nice sweater, can you be forgiven for doing something immoral? I think that's a lot harder to answer.
But if it's a really good sweater.
It's a pretty rough time, you know, but like, that's a much harder answer, you know? And what Brooke wants is not nice sweater. It's like, it's situated or talked about as
Mhm.
tangible objects. Really, sort of the dramatic action focuses on her wanting to buy an apartment that she can afford. People need to have a home, like that's not, they don't need to have a one-bedroom apartment in Manhattan, but you know, they do need to have a home.
Well, that's what it ends up signifying for her.
That's right.
It's
Yeah.
not, you know, all of these sweaters, apartments, it's all what, it's some combination of worth,
Identity.
home, identity. One thing I found myself wondering is, and not to get all sort of Oedipal about it, but is there some, and correct me if I'm wrong, but like Brooke doesn't, there's no father, right? I mean,
Yeah.
there's a father, but there's no,
She
there's a
doesn't,
father in her life,
she doesn't have a father,
right?
and he doesn't have, he had a daughter,
And
and
he
he has
does-
died
right.
on 9/11.
So
That is a very, that's like the easiest out. That's like the algebra thing you do as practice before you have to do your homework, where the answer is right there for you.
Yeah.
But is that the answer? Like sometimes people are very simple and straightforward, and their motivations are very straightforward. And you know, your friend who like is really weird about ordering dinner, when they tell you like, oh, my mom always called me fat, you're like, right, okay, the answer is like right here. It's very clear to me. You know, or your friend, like I have a friend whose father, he's gone now, but he was like a true child of the Depression. And that dictated like so much of their family life that you would like never throw a tea bag away or like never throw a bottle away. Like it just was like that sort of like
The soap.
established
The soap.
everything about the family life, right? Like
you know, slivers.
yeah, and that's so sometimes those things are very legible. But sometimes this will sound like a strange thing to say about like the people I make up, but people are mysterious.
Hmm.
And they behave in ways that are illogical and not always predictable or legibly predicated on like the conditions I'm just describing. Like their psychology is more complicated than that.
Did
Yeah.
Brooke surprise you?
Well, what's weird to say about a novel that I wrote is that I don't think she ever comes into focus by design for the reader or for me.
Mhm.
She floats along in the book, but she's a little hard to hold on to. Because I think that makes the novel its most effective. Because I hope what happens is that you start to feel like, well, how would I behave?
Completely. It's
in
like,
this
it's,
situation?
in different novels, it could be like, the use of white space or
Right.
like the way, like, how does the reader enter the novel? Like really enter the novel, like how does the novel open up and allow the space for the reader to be, sort of absolutely inside of it, and this is the way in this
Particular,
particular book.
You know what I do want to do is open it up
Yeah,
to
let's
questions.
let's do
So
that.
has it, I don't know how anybody would have read the book because it came out yesterday. So has anybody here read it? Okay. So you can't ask any questions related to the book unless you want to make up.
Well, no, I mean,
Something,
I have a
but-
question that I think is related to the book because you've been talking about it. So in terms of researching and creating this authentic super billionaire and trying to get into a super billionaire's head or what this is all about, how, as an author, do you go about sort of finding
Mhm.
an authentic way
No.
to really produce that?
I've been doing a lot of press in the UK where their journalistic approach is a little different than it is in this culture. And somebody said to me, "Are you rich?" And I was very flattered by that. And I was like, "No, I'm gay." So I understand the confusion. I have amazing taste, so I see that. But it is a symptom of the culture that I'm describing, which is that we are all trained in the modes and languages of wealth. We normal people may not be able to distinguish between Bottega Veneta and the Row. But I mean, I can, again, I'm gay, but we know what Gucci is, we know what Fendi is, we know, like, this is like what the culture cares about. And it is what it is constantly talking about, is acquisition and buying and selling. It is inescapable. It is inescapable. When my older son, the first time he went on the school bus was the first time he heard, because he was the first. So with your first, you really control what happens to them. It was the first time he heard the radio. And he said to me at one point, "Oh, it's gonna be Toyota-thon soon." You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And I said, "Oh, baby, that's not a holiday. It's a method to sell you a Toyota." But he was a kid, like, how could he know?
Right.
And why should he know? Because that is like
That's a
how
great
debased
story.
the culture we live in. This is America. That is like what we care about. So yes, I know as like somebody who works in magazines and lives in New York City and lives in Brooklyn and has kids who go to public school, right? Like, I have a maybe more than glancing familiarity with people who have a lot of money, and some people who have like a crazy amount of money. But that sort of comes with the territory too of American life. You can have that experience living in Houston or living in Ann Arbor. Like, this country is full of anonymous rich people, and there are differences in how that plays out in East Hampton versus in Coral Gables. Like, it's not the same thing, but even the fact that I can make that distinction as someone who is not of that world affirms what I think I'm saying, which is that this culture is obsessed with money. Obsessed with money.
I thought about that. I was in Petoskey, Michigan yesterday, where I'd never been. It's a wealthy community in the Upper Peninsula
Oh, yeah.
on Lake Michigan. Beautiful homes. And we were, the woman who owns the bookstore there and I were talking, and the way people think about wealth there is very Midwestern. that
Say
it
more about that, because that doesn't,
Midwestern
anything.
in the sense that in the Northeast, I think people are quite comfortable displaying wealth, particularly in New York.
Mhm.
But I think in the Midwest, in some communities in the Midwest, displaying wealth is more like what displaying wealth might have been 50 years ago.
Yeah,
Maybe
right,
50
yeah.
years ago isn't even far back enough where that was not a cool thing to be doing, that you would talk about money. Whereas now it's in some communities, it's a calling card. It gives you standing.
But if you're a novelist, and this is like, it's like to go back to the red car, analogy.
Mhm.
There's a way in which whatever you're training your instrument toward, whatever you're training your mind toward, in this case, what you're absorbing, in terms of, this particular kind of New York City wealth. If you were in, where is it?
Petoskey,
Petoskey,
Michigan.
No,
then it would be
it'd be different.
that version.
That's
or you-
right.
Or you kind of have this mental, I keep on thinking about this thing as we're talking, which is, I'm staying in this borrowed house right now, because we're renovating our kitchen. And there's an estate at the end of the road the road has the dirt road in Litchfield County, it has some beautiful, modest 1800s houses, and at the end there is this estate that even by Litchfield County standards is a crazy estate. And every day, like something out of a Don DeLillo novel, there are multiple water trucks
Mm.
going up the dirt road because the estate doesn't have any water. And I happen to know
There you go.
somebody who knows the family whose estate it is, and this has been going on for 15 years.
wow.
And that has completely captured my imagination. Because,
Rightly so.
right,
Yeah,
right, so
no.
I think when you're a novelist and you have certain themes or obsessions, it's like the world sort of acts in around you, acts in support of those.
And it teaches you enough to know what you can make up,
Mhm.
Yeah.
right? Like the aim is not like verisimilitude or like this doesn't have to go to a New Yorker fact checker. And so I do have a friend who works at Christie's who there's a scene in Christie's in the book. So I did do like that kind of research. And
For
she
the
did,
price of art.
right, and
Would you do that as you were getting to that moment in a scene and think, I need to know what?
honestly, I did it more out of a personal motivation and a personal desire to go to Christie's.
Mm.
And- But I'm just-
Because you get,
again, I have great taste. It does not disappoint, to get the experience of going to Christie's, which again, sort of affirms my larger point. Christie's is a store.
Mhm.
It is a store
And a business.
and a business. And you can go there and go, as I did, and go into the basement and see a Christo, like I don't know, a Picasso. Someone's getting a divorce. They don't know what to do. The Picasso goes to Christie's. It's literally sitting in the basement. And they are waiting to find a buyer or they're holding it for a sale. It is a little, yeah, you can make it up within reason. But I will say, if you want to read a really good nonfiction book about wealth at an astronomical scale, I would read this book called Empty Mansions. I don't know if you know this book, but there's a woman named Huguette Clark, she's died now, who had one of those like weird, like her life spanned such a strange amount of time that it seems like it couldn't be possible. But her father was he owned copper mines. I think it was copper. And it was like the Gilded Age, New York. And they had money at like the most abstract level. Something sort of happened to her developmentally, and she went to live in a hospital. And she lived in a hospital for like much of the end of her life.
But for decades.
Decades. And her nurse ended up sort of stealing a huge amount of her fortune. But she owned a home in Santa Barbara that had never been visited. So for 5 decades, The driver polished the cars and like had them ready for her, and like the dishes were washed and everything was ready to go, and she never went there because she was in a hospital on the Upper East Side. In fact, nobody knew where she was. The lawyers didn't know where she was. And it's a great book about like
Yeah, it's really good.
abstract
What's
wealth.
that called?
It's called Empty Mansions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why don't we take one more question, sir?
Well, I just had one observation first, which is I also live in Northwest Connecticut. And if they haven't had water for 15 years, they don't want to have water.
Yeah.
Right.
Interesting.
When I was listening, going back when we were talking about wealth, philanthropy, it kind of reminded me there's sort of this idea of the deserving and undeserving rich, which reminded me of the same kind of talk you make about poor, the deserving and undeserving poor. You know, the deserving poor family who's homeless seems to have more right to access those kind of programs or things, as opposed to what we would look at as the undeserving poor. And I was kind of struck with that same concept with the wealthy, you know. I mean, it's just they're wealthy. Whether they're undeserving or deserving, they're still in the same.
Especially generational wealth, which is like harder to argue for. If you are someone who has invented something or created a business and it's proven really successful, that's one thing. If you are the child of that person, that's another thing. And in fact, one of the most sort of vocal estate reform advocates in the country is a woman sort of tangentially related to Walt Disney, who speaks very candidly about how preposterous it is that Abigail Disney, that she can possess money at the scale to which
As does Warren Buffett,
you know,
and his family.
and Warren Buffett with his family, and Gates and Buffett, who have sort of pledged to give away a lot of their money, as Asher does. It's not it's not that you sort of lose all moral compass when you possess a lot of money, but I do think it is a very powerful force, and I think it's operative in a lot of our lives. And I do think you're right that like it is easier because it is more common to judge the poor, and you do it without thinking. And it's painful to realize that you do it. That when you are in New York City, where it is in close quarters and you're on the subway and you see somebody in real crisis, that your instinct is not to be moved as a human being because society has not allowed you that latitude. So your instinct is to think, well, this person they've made some choice that's brought them here. Even though we know that that's not really true, and even if they have made some choice that's brought them there, they're still a person.
And they're still there.
And it has been very powerful for me to see to be with my children when they were smaller in that state, because they were unable to understand it. And it was one of those things where I was like, right, I should not be able to understand this. If someone is sleeping on the subway, that is it is not a comprehensible circumstance. And it's one of those moments where you sort of wish for the clarity of a 5-year-old mind, because it's easy for us to talk about that in the lens of policy or all of these other abstractions that sort of get you away from the central question. And in fact, one of the reasons this book is called Entitlement, one of the things I love about the word is that entitlement is the policy language for public policy.
That's right. Yeah.
So it describes
More
the
rich people are
attitude of
entitled
rich
than-
people, and it also describes the policy by which the society agrees to remedy the state of the poorest.
So what I would like to close with is this, you know, one of the great things that great books can do for us is put us in another person's shoes without judging them and developing a kind of empathy versus disdain or sympathy that educates us and makes us better people. And I think, Rumaan, your book does just that. I think that you can't help but read this and think about someone like Brooke or someone like Asher or Kim, which is one of the roommates, in a different way. Like, those characters will stay with me as I operate my day-to-day life. I will think differently about things that I witness or experience differently because of what you've written
Thank you.
in this book. And I think that that's the best we can hope for from reading fiction. So I want to thank you
Thank you.
for that. And, you know, I hope you Dani is a prominent writer. She does not live around the corner. And Dani, what you do, not only for all of us as readers, but what you do for other writers is a gift to all of us. You know, she slept down here to be in conversation with
It was really tough to go out and have a lovely friend. My friend Rumaan and my friend Roxanne.
Yeah.
Be with all of you.
You still can
Hardship.
you still can take PJs and a book
Yeah.
and a glass of wine. I mean, there are choices. There are
90
choices.
minutes. That's all.
So, you know, I wanna thank you for that. And I wanna thank you really smart people for showing up.
And where do we get our book?
Yeah, you can get the book, tonight. And Rumaan will be happy to sign it for you. You could, for those of you who haven't read Signal Fires, I recommend, you're gonna have, if you buy both books,
You're not gonna sleep if you.
You're not gonna
books,
sleep.
Yeah.
I mean, you're just not. So you're gonna have to decide based on your mood which book you're gonna pick up, but you're not gonna be disappointed in either of them. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. And if you would join me in a round of applause.